For 7 days, Keanu Reeves vanished. No cameras, no bodyguards, just a tattered coat and a few crumpled dollars. Living as a beggar on the brutal streets of Los Angeles, he searched for something deeper than fame. But what he discovered in the darkness changed everything. You won't believe how this incredible story ends. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. For most people, disappearing from the world is impossible. For Keanu Reeves, it was a choice. One cold morning in November, he walked away from his fame, his fortune, and everything that made him recognizable. No entourage, no cameras, no one knew where he was going, not even his closest friends. He left behind his sleek motorcycle in the garage and locked his mansion's door with quiet finality. The world would wonder where he had gone, but Keanu wasn't leaving forever. He was leaving to find something. For years, Keanu had donated millions to children's hospitals, cancer research, and programs supporting the homeless. His generosity was whispered about in Hollywood circles and sung like legends online. But no matter how much he gave, a question lingered in his mind. What is it really like? What happens when the cameras are off and the lights go out? He wanted to know. Not from behind a checkbook, but by walking in their shoes, by feeling it for himself. And so, for 1 week, Keanu decided to vanish into the heart of Skid Row in Los Angeles. The decision wasn't reckless, it was deliberate. He'd spent months preparing, in private. He read stories from people who had lived on the streets. He studied survival guides, learning where shelters were, which streets were safest at night, and how to stay warm with next to nothing. But books and documentaries could only prepare him so much. The reality hit the moment he stepped onto 5th Street in the middle of Skid Row. Gone was the clean-cut action star. In his place was a tired man in a worn gray hoodie and faded jeans, with a scruffy beard that shaded his solemn face. He carried only a small, battered backpack. Inside were 3 things: a cheap blanket, a plastic water bottle, and a pencil with a dog-eared notebook. His phone, wallet, and identity had been left behind, on purpose. There was no safety net. No one would recognize him here. That was the point. As Keanu stood there, watching the world rush by, he realized something immediately. No one looked at him. The same man who couldn't walk through a grocery store without being stopped for a selfie was now completely invisible. People rushed past, businessmen, tourists, cars with tinted windows, but no one noticed him. No one cared. The afternoon sun baked the cracked pavement as Keanu wandered aimlessly. He'd planned to find a safe spot early, but his instincts told him to keep moving. He didn't know the unspoken rules of this world yet. Where to sit, when to talk, who to avoid. By nightfall, his feet ached from walking in worn-out sneakers. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he didn't eat. He was rationing the crumpled $3 in his pocket. He knew it wouldn't last. As darkness fell, Keanu found himself near an alleyway behind an old pawn shop. The air smelled of rot and gasoline. Cardboard boxes were scattered along the wall, marked by signs of someone having slept there the night before. He hesitated, wondering if he was trespassing, but exhaustion left him with no choice. He slid down against the concrete wall, pulling his hood tighter over his face. The concrete was cold against his back, and the thin blanket he carried barely kept the chill away. That first night was the hardest. He heard shouting in the distance. A bottle broke somewhere down the street. Sirens wailed far off. A rat scurried past his foot. Every sound was sharp, every breath felt heavy. No one spoke to him. No one offered help. In fact, no one even saw him. Keanu was alone in a way he had never been before. Not on a film set surrounded by hundreds, not in a quiet hotel room between shoots. This was different. This was solitude at its rawest. He wrapped his arms around himself and waited for sleep, but it didn't come. The cold was merciless, creeping into his bones. His body ached in ways he hadn't expected. He thought about home, about his soft bed, about a warm shower, and then he shook the thoughts away. He wasn't here to long for comfort. He was here to understand. By morning, his back was stiff and his head throbbed from lack of sleep. His mouth was dry, but he forced himself to drink only a few sips of water. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows between the buildings. He stood and stretched, his muscles protesting every movement. As he walked toward the main street, he caught his reflection in a store window. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. His face was hollow, his eyes tired. He looked ordinary, forgettable. And it struck him how easy it was for people to fall through the cracks and never be seen again. Keanu's first 24 hours on the streets taught him something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the hunger or the cold that wore people down. It was the feeling of being invisible, like you didn't matter, like you were already gone. And as he took his next steps down the cracked sidewalk, Keanu knew one thing for certain. He was only just beginning to understand what this world was really like. By the second morning, Keanu's body ached in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every muscle protested as he pushed himself up from the cold concrete. His blanket was damp from the night air, and his fingers trembled as he tried to fold it neatly back into his backpack. His breath made small clouds in the crisp air as he took slow steps down the cracked sidewalk. But as he looked around, he realized something had changed. He was starting to notice things most people missed. Near a crumbling wall covered in faded graffiti, a woman sat cross-legged with a makeshift easel propped up in front of her. She held a small, bent paintbrush in one hand and a palette made from a styrofoam plate in the other. The colors were limited, mostly browns and blues, but what she painted was beautiful. The details were delicate. A sunrise over a city skyline, but not the polished glass towers tourists like to photograph. This skyline showed rooftops patched with tarps, telephone poles tangled with wires, and laundry flapping from broken windows. Keanu watched her for a while before gathering the courage to speak. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. She didn't look up at first. Her hand continued its careful strokes. Then, slowly, she turned to glance at him. Her dark eyes were wary, but there was something fierce behind them too. "Doesn't matter," she said. "Nobody buys." "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara," she replied. "And you're new?" Keanu nodded. "I'm John." He'd chosen the name for this journey. Simple, anonymous, safe. Clara smirked faintly. "Welcome to Skid Row, John. You got something to trade?" Keanu shook his head. "Just conversation." "Then sit," she said, nodding to the pavement beside her. "But don't expect much." He did as she asked, lowering himself onto the cold ground again. As she painted, he noticed the cracks in her fingers, stained with color. Her shoes were held together with strips of cloth, and she wore 3 shirts beneath a tattered jacket to fight off the cold. But she painted with a precision that could have rivaled gallery artists. For a moment, Keanu saw the studio she might have owned in another life. Maybe she had. "Wait here?" he asked after a long silence. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because sometimes the roof disappears. Then the job. Then the rest." Keanu nodded slowly. "But you still paint?" Her brush paused. She stared at the canvas for a moment. "What else is there?" Later that day, Keanu wandered farther down the street and found another story. An older man sat on an overturned milk crate, his hair gray and wiry beneath a frayed beanie. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, one lens cracked, and held a book in his lap. A real book. Worn pages fluttered in the breeze as he turned them carefully. Keanu stood nearby for a while, curious, before the man looked up. His gaze was sharp, not the fogged-over stare of someone lost to despair. "You can sit," the man said simply. Keanu did. "What are you reading?" "Poetry," the man replied. "Frost." Keanu smiled faintly. "I liked his work growing up." "Most people did," the man said. "They just forgot why." "What's your name?" Keanu asked. Raymond. The two men sat in silence for a long time. Keanu could feel the weight of the book in Raymond's hands, the reverence with which he treated each line of verse. This was a man who had loved words once, who had taught them to others. "Were you a teacher?" Keanu finally asked. Raymond smiled wryly. "Good guess. Literature. For 25 years. "What happened?" Keanu asked, careful with the question. Raymond shrugged. "The usual. Laid off. Pension disappeared, wife passed away, savings went to medical bills." He closed the book and tapped the cover gently. "All I kept were the words." Keanu's chest tightened. He had spent his life around people who chased fame and fortune, but here was someone who had quietly given everything to others, and now sat on a street corner with nothing but a torn jacket and a paperback book. The stories repeated themselves over the next few days. Keanu found people fixing old radios, weaving baskets from scraps, even repairing bicycles with tools made from junk. Everywhere he turned, there was talent, skill, intelligence. But the world had turned its back on them. And then came the second night. Keanu had found a spot near a boarded-up building. It was quieter there, away from the main streets, and he thought he might sleep better. He curled beneath his blanket and used his backpack as a pillow. Exhaustion dragged at him, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, he felt it, the tug on his backpack. His eyes snapped open just as someone yanked it from under his head. A figure darted away into the dark. Keanu scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding, but it was too late. His blanket, notebook, and water bottle, all gone. He stood there in the cold, breathing hard, fists clenched at his sides, but there was no one to chase, and no one to care. "You shouldn't sleep alone," a voice said quietly behind him. Keanu turned to see a woman, probably in her 50s, with deep lines around her mouth. She wore a mismatched sweater and pants too short for her legs. She held something in her arms, a blanket. She walked closer and held it out. "Take it." Keanu hesitated. "You need it." She shook her head. "I'll find another." "You won't." She pressed the blanket into his hands and turned to walk away without another word. Later that night, Keanu sat under an overhang with the blanket wrapped tightly around him. He stared out at the city's empty streets. He felt the weight of that gesture in his chest. She had nothing, and yet she gave. He found a discarded piece of cardboard and a stub of pencil the next morning. He began writing again, scribbling notes, sketches, ideas. He wrote about Clara and Raymond, about the woman who had shared her blanket, about the kindness he saw between strangers, about the cruelty of a world that ignored them. It wasn't just poverty. It wasn't just addiction or bad choices. It was something deeper, a blindness, a refusal to see the value in people who had fallen through the cracks. By his fourth day, Keanu saw the truth with painful clarity. The crisis wasn't just homelessness. It was wasted potential. It was the world looking away from talent, intelligence, and creativity because it didn't wear a suit or live in the right zip code. He watched Clara trade a small painting for a sandwich, watched Raymond quote poetry in exchange for a clean pair of socks, and he realized that the greatest resource these streets had wasn't food or shelter. It was people, brilliant, creative, resourceful people. People no one was investing in. And as Keanu wrote in his notebook, he felt a quiet fire build inside him. There was a bigger story here, a deeper problem, but maybe, just maybe, there was also a solution. Keanu awoke to the quiet shuffle of footsteps and the faint sound of a broom sweeping the cracked pavement. Dawn was breaking, pale orange light filtering through a haze of smog. He sat up slowly, stretching out the stiffness that came from another night on concrete. The blanket the older woman had given him was folded neatly by his side. He would find her later to return it, though something told him she wouldn't ask for it back. Around him, the alley was coming to life in its own way. People moved with deliberate purpose, checking on their few belongings, scavenging for scraps of food, and setting up makeshift stalls along the sidewalks. It wasn't much, but it was their daily rhythm. They had carved a fragile ecosystem out of nothing. Keanu dusted off his clothes, layers of second-hand fabric, and joined the flow. He had already begun to learn the unspoken rules: move with intent, don't take more space than you need, and always acknowledge someone's presence with a nod. That gesture meant everything here. It was respect, recognition, humanity. His first stop was Clara's spot. She was already working, crouched on the cold pavement with a paintbrush in hand. A large piece of plywood had become her canvas, and a brilliant mural was taking shape. Waves of color told the story of life on the streets, the gray edges of despair slowly giving way to deep blues and bursts of gold. It was painful and beautiful, and Keanu couldn't take his eyes off it. "You're early," Clara said without looking up. "I'm learning," Keanu replied, kneeling beside her. She glanced at him then, her gaze softer than before. "You want to help?" "I'll wait." She handed him a plastic cup half filled with water. "Brushes need cleaning every half hour. Keep them from drying out." He took the cup and nodded, settling into the task. They worked in silence, and he found a kind of peace in the quiet rhythm of her art. Every stroke told a story. Every color revealed something she couldn't say aloud. And as he cleaned the brushes, he felt the weight of her trust. Later that morning, Keanu moved onto Raymond's spot. The old teacher was hunched over a broken transistor radio, his cracked glasses slipping down his nose as he carefully connected wires. "Morning," Keanu greeted. Raymond glanced up, smiling faintly. "John, just in time." "For what?" Raymond gestured at the tangle of wires in his lap. "I need a steady hand. Hold this." Keanu crouched beside him, gripping the wire as directed. He watched, fascinated, as Raymond worked with meticulous precision, using tools he had fashioned himself. An old hairpin became a wire stripper. A rusted screwdriver, honed sharp, acted as a soldering tool, heated over a tiny flame. "I used to teach this," Raymond said. "Electronics and physics. Now I fix radios for extra bread." Keanu felt a familiar ache in his chest. "You still teach," he said softly. "I'm learning." Raymond chuckled dryly. "One student at a time." As the day wore on, Keanu found ways to help. He carried supplies from one part of the alley to another: blankets, boxes of salvaged goods, even a broken wheelchair that needed repairing. He joined a group rebuilding a makeshift shelter after a recent storm had torn through the encampment. They used pallets, plastic tarps, and rope scrounged from dumpsters. It was far from sturdy, but it was something. And when they finished, the man who would sleep there that night shook Keanu's hand with a grip that spoke volumes. "You work hard," the man said. "Not many do when they're new." Keanu nodded, feeling the dirt and sweat on his skin like a badge of honor. He was exhausted, but the warmth in his chest was stronger than the fatigue. By nightfall, he was back at Clara's mural. She had added more details. Faces this time. A child smiling through cracked lips. An old man gazing at a distant skyline. Their eyes told stories of hope and loss in equal measure. "You're good," Keanu said. Clara shrugged. "Doesn't matter, no one's buying." "I would," Keanu said before he could stop himself. She gave him a long look. "Then why haven't you?" Keanu smiled faintly. "No money." She laughed. A real, genuine laugh. It was brief, but it lit her face in a way he hadn't seen before. As they sat there, sharing a piece of stale bread Clara had traded for a painting, Keanu felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He wasn't John. He wasn't just another drifter learning to survive. He was Keanu Reeves, an actor, a millionaire, a man with options these people would never dream of having. And they trusted him. He stared at Clara as she hummed softly to herself, her hands never stopping their work. He watched Raymond as he repaired another piece of broken tech under a dim flashlight, his lips moving silently as he recited lines of poetry to himself. And he felt sick. They deserved the truth, but telling them now would ruin everything. So he stayed silent, and the guilt grew heavier. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. Keanu was helping Raymond carry salvaged wires back to his crate when he noticed a group of city workers in bright orange vests moving through the alley. They were accompanied by 2 police officers. The workers marked certain tents and structures with red spray paint, large X's sprayed across makeshift walls and tarps. "What's happening?" Keanu asked. Raymond's expression darkened. "Clearance. They do this sometimes." The workers moved efficiently, leaving behind a trail of red marks. One of them posted a notice on a wooden pole. Keanu walked over and tore it down to read. It was an official warning. In 3 days, the entire encampment would be cleared. Any structures left behind would be destroyed. Personal belongings would be seized. People would be forced out. He read the notice twice, just to be sure, then a third time, hoping it would change. 3 days, Raymond said behind him. That's generous. Sometimes it's 1. Keanu's hands clenched the paper tightly. "Where do people go?" Raymond shrugged. "Nowhere, anywhere, back to hiding." Keanu turned slowly, scanning the alley. He saw Clara, painting as if nothing had changed. He saw the woman who had shared her blanket, quietly sorting through a box of old clothes. He saw men and women trying to create some kind of life in a place no one cared about, and it was all about to be wiped away. Again. That night, the mood in the alley was different, quieter, heavy. People whispered in small groups, debating where they might go. Some planned to move to another part of the city. Others spoke of shelters already full or unsafe. Some didn't have a plan at all. Keanu sat by the fire with Raymond and Clara. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The crackle of flames filled the silence between them. Finally, Clara spoke. "They think we're trash." "No," Raymond corrected quietly. "They think we're invisible. Trash you at least see." Keanu stared into the fire. His fingers itched to write in his notebook, but the pencil was worn to a stub and the pages were running out. He didn't need more notes. He knew what he had to do. But how? His mind raced through possibilities. He could call someone, pull in favors, get the media here, shine a spotlight on the injustice. But not as John, not like this. He would have to reveal who he was, and that could destroy everything. But if he didn't, these people would lose everything they'd managed to build, from nothing. Raymond poked at the fire absently. "It's always the same," he murmured. "They move us along, pretend we aren't here, and then they wonder why things don't get better." Clara rested her chin on her knees. "It's not fair," she whispered. Keanu's jaw tightened. No, it wasn't, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. Not if he could stop it. As the fire burned low, he made his decision. He would tell them, not yet, but soon. And then, he would do what he always did. Fight. Keanu sat beneath the faded awning of an abandoned shop, his notebook balanced on his knee. The edges were frayed now, the cover smudged with dirt and the faint residue of charcoal dust from Clara's mural. His pencil, worn to a splintered stub, scratched softly against the page as he sketched another line. This time, not an observation or reflection, but a plan. A quiet plan. He didn't sleep much after the city's notice went up. It haunted him. He watched Clara paint late into the night, her brush steady despite the weight she must have felt. Raymond kept tinkering with broken electronics, as if willing the world to stay in order by repairing it piece by piece. Others packed quietly, already preparing for the inevitable. And Keanu scribbled furiously into the early hours because he couldn't sit still. He had to act. By morning, he was moving. Without fanfare or announcement, Keanu approached the vendors who lined the nearby avenues. These were people he'd been watching since his first day. Those who sold day-old bread, bruised fruit, bottled water that had been refilled more than once. He knew their margins were slim, but he also knew desperation sometimes made room for generosity. He offered small trades at first, a handful of aluminum cans he'd collected, exchanged for 2 bruised apples, a mended jacket, something Raymond had stitched up the night before. traded for a loaf of bread. He smiled quietly, said very little, but he always offered something. The exchanges were simple, humble, yet they built something critical: trust. By the second afternoon, word had spread. John, the quiet one, was resourceful, fair. He didn't beg, didn't steal, and when he promised to bring something back in exchange, he did. Vendors who had once avoided his eye now nodded as he passed. Some even set things aside for him. What Keanu was doing wasn't much. A few apples here, a packet of aspirin there, but it fed people. It brought blankets and bottles of clean water into hands that had been empty the night before. And more importantly, it sparked something. An idea. He returned to the alley as the sun dipped low and Raymond was waiting. "What's this?" the old teacher asked, gesturing to the small bag Keanu carried. Keanu opened it slowly, revealing half a dozen sandwiches and 2 bottles of water. "Trade," he said, quietly. Raymond raised his eyebrows. "You didn't have anything to trade this morning." "I do now," Keanu answered. He handed the sandwiches out one by one, carefully rationing them. He took none for himself. Later that evening, under the flicker of Clara's makeshift lantern, Keanu unrolled his notebook and showed them his sketches. "I have an idea," he began, "but it only works if we all believe in it." Clara leaned forward, eyes flickering between the drawings. "What is this?" "A co-op," Keanu explained, his voice low but sure. "A way to pool our skills. Everyone contributes what they can. We trade, we build, we offer services to vendors and others in the area. Repairs, art, labor, whatever it is, we make it valuable." Raymond rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Barter system." "More than that," Keanu said. "A network. We make ourselves necessary, and in doing that, we create stability. Maybe even a future." Clara's eyes were sharp, skeptical. "And who's going to make this happen? You?" "We all do," Keanu replied. "This belongs to everyone." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Raymond nodded slowly. "We're already halfway there," he murmured. "Clara's murals get attention. I fix things. Thomas..." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Thomas is good at protecting people." Keanu glanced at Clara. "And you're the voice. People listen to you." She gave a small, almost bitter laugh. "They listen when they think I'm selling something." "Then we sell hope," Keanu said. It was a quiet beginning. That night, Clara painted new signs, ones with simple messages: trades welcome, repairs offered. Raymond fixed an old cart to serve as a mobile workshop, while Keanu and others approached nearby businesses with offers of cheap labor in exchange for food or supplies. They cleaned alleys, hauled boxes, painted walls. It wasn't charity. It was work. And it mattered. The mood in the encampment shifted. The looming deadline for eviction still hung heavy in the air, but there was a spark of hope. For once, they were doing something other than waiting for the worst to come. But not everyone was convinced. On the morning of day 6, Keanu felt the tension before he saw its source. Thomas stood at the edge of the alley, arms crossed over his chest, watching him with hard eyes. Thomas had always kept his distance, suspicious of Keanu from the beginning. Now he was openly hostile. "You've been busy," Thomas said when Keanu approached. "I've been helping," Keanu replied. Thomas didn't smile. "Is that what you call it?" Keanu stood still, saying nothing. Thomas stepped closer. His voice was low, but the anger in it was clear. "You show up out of nowhere. You keep to yourself. You don't beg. You trade like you know how the game works. And suddenly, you've got everyone listening to you." "I'm listening to them," Keanu said quietly. "Yeah?" Thomas sneered. "Funny. You don't talk like the rest of us. You're too calm. Too clean." Keanu's jaw tightened. He knew this would come eventually. "What do you want, Thomas?" "The truth," Thomas snapped. "Who are you, really?" For a moment, Keanu didn't answer. The air between them was thick with unspoken challenge. Thomas's fists clenched at his sides. Keanu took a slow breath. I'm someone who wants to help. Thomas laughed bitterly. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. Thomas shook his head. You're lying. Keanu looked down at his hands, scarred and dirty from 6 days of work, and then back at Thomas. I'm not lying, he said, his voice steady. But I haven't told you everything. Why not? Thomas demanded. Because it would change everything, Keanu admitted, and I needed you to trust the idea, not me. Thomas's gaze sharpened. What are you hiding? Keanu closed his eyes briefly, gathering the courage he wasn't sure he had. Then he opened them again. My name isn't John. Thomas stared at him. What is it then? Keanu, he said quietly. Keanu Reeves? For a heartbeat there was nothing. No reaction. Then Thomas took a half step back, his expression unreadable. You're joking. Keanu shook his head. I wish I were. Thomas's jaw clenched. He looked away, breathing hard. You're telling me you're him, the actor? Keanu nodded. And you've been here, why? Keanu kept his gaze steady. To understand, to help, to learn what it really means to live here. And now, to do something about it. Thomas swore under his breath, pacing a few steps away before turning back. You think you can just buy your way out of this? Out of lying to us? No, Keanu said. I don't expect forgiveness, but I couldn't sit back and watch anymore. Thomas's eyes narrowed. So what now, you flash your name and think that's enough? Keanu shook his head. No. I keep working, with or without your approval. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he finally spoke, his tone quieter but no less intense. If you're lying, if you're playing some game, I'm not, Keanu said. Thomas studied him for another moment. Then he nodded, just once. Then prove it. I will. The confrontation left Keanu shaken but resolute. He gathered Clara and Raymond that evening and told them the truth. He expected anger, accusations, betrayal. But Clara only sighed, rubbing her temples. I knew you were different, she said. I just didn't know why. Raymond chuckled softly. You still owe me a radio, he said. They stayed up late, planning, working. Clara repainted her signs with bolder colors. Raymond worked on a solar charger prototype with parts Keanu had quietly purchased. Thomas even joined them, sitting in the background, watching but not interfering. And Keanu prepared to go public. He called in favors. Quietly, without spectacle, he arranged for media coverage. He drafted statements, and he made sure, above all, that the story would be about the people he had come to respect, about Clara's art, about Raymond's inventions, about Thomas's leadership, not about him. On the 7th morning, Keanu stood in the alley as the sun rose over Skid Row. He was no longer hiding. The truth was out. And now, it was time to fight for them. For all of them. The fire cracked softly in the middle of the alley, its glow painting flickering shadows on worn faces and battered walls. Clara sat cross-legged with a sketchbook balanced on her knee, though she hadn't drawn a line in over an hour. Raymond fiddled with the wires of a broken radio, his eyes darting toward Keanu every few minutes. Thomas, silent as ever, leaned against the brick wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Keanu sat still, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. The weight of the truth he was about to share pressed heavily against his chest, making it harder to breathe. For 6 days he had walked among them as one of their own. Now, he would tear away the mask. He took a breath and raised his eyes to meet the circle of expectant faces. There's something I need to tell you. Raymond looked up from the tangle of wires in his lap. Clara's gaze sharpened. Thomas didn't move. Keanu cleared his throat. My name isn't John. Clara's brow furrowed, confused. What do you mean? Keanu's voice was quiet, steady. My real name is Keanu Reeves. For a moment, silence blanketed the alley. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Then Clara let out a sharp breath. "You're kidding." Raymond stared, as if he'd misheard. Thomas didn't blink, as if he had known all along. Keanu shook his head. "I'm not." The reaction came swiftly, like a tide breaking through a crumbling dam. "You lied to us," Clara said, her voice cold and rising. "You pretended to be one of us." Raymond set the radio down with trembling hands. "Why? Why would you do this?" Thomas pushed off from the wall and took a step forward. "I knew something was off. You're too clean, too careful." "I wanted to understand," Keanu said, forcing himself to hold their eyes. "I wanted to see what life was really like here, not as an outsider, as someone living it." Clara's mouth twisted, bitter. So this was a game? A role? Some method-acting experiment? "No," Keanu said, shaking his head. "It wasn't about acting. It wasn't a movie. It was about seeing you. Seeing the strength and potential here and realizing how wrong the world is about people like you." Thomas's stare darkened. "And what now? You write a check, pat yourself on the back, and leave?" Keanu's pulse pounded, but he kept his voice level. "I'm not here for a photo op. I'm not here to make a film. I'm here because this can't keep happening. I've seen too much. I won't walk away." The air thickened. Murmurs from the surrounding crowd rose, like an approaching wave. They had gathered slowly as the conversation unfolded. Dozens of men and women stood in the shadows, some whispering, others glaring. Clara crossed her arms. "And we're supposed to just trust you?" "No," Keanu said. "You shouldn't trust me. Not yet." Thomas took another step, closing the space between them. "Then why should we listen to anything you say?" Keanu straightened his back. "Because I'm offering more than words." He reached down beside him and pulled out the notebook. It was battered, covered in smudges and sweat, but its pages were full of possibilities. Keanu opened it to the first sketch he'd shown Raymond and Clara 2 nights ago. $1 million, Keanu said. "To start." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara shook her head, disbelief hardening her features. "You're serious?" "I am," Keanu said. "A pilot program. Jobs, training, housing. Real opportunities. No red tape. No false promises." Raymond stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception. "Why?" he asked quietly. Keanu's voice softened. "Because you've shown me what real potential looks like. And I believe in it. I believe in you." Thomas still looked unconvinced. "Money fixes everything, huh?" "No," Keanu replied. "But it can buy time. It can create space for people to build something lasting." The fire snapped, sending a spray of sparks into the night air. For a long time, no one said anything. Then Raymond nodded, slowly. "What's the catch?" "There isn't one," Keanu said. "This is yours. The only thing I ask is that we do it together." Clara rubbed her eyes and sighed. "You're crazy, you know that?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I've been told." Thomas looked away, his jaw clenched tight. The fire burned low. The crowd began to shift, some murmuring quietly to one another, others walking away, unsure, but a few stayed. Clara, still sitting on her crate, Raymond, watching the flames reflect in his glasses, and Thomas, standing apart but no longer glaring. As the night deepened, Keanu sat in silence, staring at the stars barely visible beyond the haze of the city. He had told them the truth. Now it was up to them to decide what came next. But dawn came faster than he expected. At first, it was the rumble of engines that pulled him from his thoughts, then the sharp metallic screech of loudspeakers crackling to life. "This is the Los Angeles City Housing Authority," the voice blared. "You are trespassing on public land. You must vacate the premises immediately." Keanu stood, his heart thudding in his chest. He saw Clara step out of her makeshift shelter, her eyes wide. Raymond grabbed his few possessions and shoved them into a battered backpack. Thomas was already moving, gathering others and barking orders to get people moving. But Keanu didn't move. Instead, he marched toward the approaching trucks. Uniformed officers spilled out, forming a line as they advanced. Behind them, cleanup crews in reflective vests waited with dumpsters and bulldozers. "This is a lawful order," the loudspeaker boomed again. "You must leave now." Keanu stopped in front of the officer at the center. "Wait." The officer, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard, didn't even glance at him. "Step aside." Keanu stepped closer. "You need to stop this." Finally, the officer looked up, his brow furrowed as he took in Keanu's face. Recognition flickered. "Wait, is that—" "I'm Keanu Reeves," he said quickly, "and you need to stop this evacuation immediately." The officer hesitated. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but we have our orders." "Then call your superior," Keanu said. "Right now." The officer hesitated again, then raised his radio. He stepped away, murmuring into it. Keanu turned and looked back at the camp. People were scattering, some crying, some shouting. Clara was gathering her paintings in a hurry, her hands shaking. Raymond clutched the shoulder of a young man Keanu hadn't met, urging him toward safety. Thomas still held the line, trying to direct people out. Minutes passed. Then the officer returned. "You've got 15 minutes, he said grudgingly. "But then we move." Keanu didn't waste time. He sprinted back toward the group. "Everyone, gather by the mural," he shouted. "Now!" Confused faces turned toward him. Some hesitated, others followed. Clara's mural, bright against the gray wall, became their rallying point. Keanu climbed onto a crate. "Listen up," he shouted. "I can't stop them forever, but I can buy us time." Heads turned. People froze, waiting. "I've secured a temporary shelter," he said. "Transportation is on its way. It's not perfect, but it's safe." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "It's not just about where we sleep," Keanu said. "It's about what we build. Together. This," he pointed to the mural, to Raymond's tools, to Thomas's people. "This is the beginning." Thomas stepped forward. "He's right," he growled. "We don't have a choice." Slowly, people began to move. They gathered their belongings. They helped those who couldn't walk. Raymond took charge of the tools. Clara cradled her paintings as if they were children. Thomas kept count, barking orders when necessary. And then the buses arrived. Keanu had called in every favor he had left. Former colleagues, old friends, allies who didn't ask questions. The buses were unmarked, but they were there. They opened their doors. It took time, but one by one the camp emptied. Keanu was the last to board, standing beside Thomas, who kept glancing back at the alley. "You coming?" Keanu asked. Thomas gave him a long look. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said gruffly, "but this better be more than talk." Keanu nodded. "It is." As the buses pulled away, Keanu looked back at the place he'd called home for 7 days. The mural still glowed in the dawn light, Clara's colors defiant against the gray. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The buses had carried them away from Skid Row in the early dawn, but Keanu's mind hadn't stopped racing since. By noon, he was back in the city. No disguise, no torn clothes, no backpack stuffed with scraps. He stood in front of the Los Angeles City Council chambers in a crisp black jacket, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady. They hadn't expected him to show up. They hadn't expected him to come with a plan. The council meeting room was sterile and cold, the walls blank, the rows of seats filled with officials, aides, and a few reporters who had caught wind of something unusual. Cameras clicked, murmurs rose as Keanu stepped to the podium. He took a breath, glanced at his notes, and then spoke. "You have 48 hours, Keanu said. His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words settled hard on the room. "I'm asking you to delay the eviction. Just 48 hours. Councilmember Rivera leaned forward, skeptical. "And why would we do that?" "Because I'm offering you something better than another cleanup," Keanu said. "A partnership. a chance to turn Skid Row into something more than a problem you keep sweeping away. Whispers swept through the council. Rivera frowned. Go on. Keanu's next words were deliberate, every syllable carved from a week's worth of pain, clarity, and resolve. I'm putting up an initial $1 million, he said. It's seed money, not for handouts, for jobs, for skills training, for a pilot program that hires the very people you're pushing out. He let the silence sit for a second longer before continuing. These aren't throwaways. They're artists, engineers, teachers, builders. You're burning down potential because you refuse to see it. Another murmur. A few heads turned, glancing at each other. The weight was shifting. Keanu could feel it. Council member Rivera glanced at his aides, then back to Keanu. You have 48 hours, he said finally, but we expect results. Keanu nodded. So do I. The next day, the alley was still quiet, but the mood had changed. The air, once heavy with exhaustion and defeat, now buzzed with cautious hope. Raymond was already there, clipboard in hand, working out of the makeshift shelter Keanu had arranged on the city's edge. The former teacher, once slumped in the shadows with his broken glasses and tired gaze, stood straighter now. His voice carried authority as he read out names from a list. Jasmine, Carlos, Mike. You're on prep duty. We're setting up the learning tents by noon. Maria, Hector, supervising the kids. Raymond glanced up from the clipboard and smiled faintly. Let's make this happen. Keanu approached quietly. How's it going? Raymond nodded. They're listening. I forgot how good it feels to be needed. You were always needed, Keanu said. Now you get to lead. The tutoring program had been Raymond's idea. He'd pitched it late that night on the bus ride out of Skid Row. Kids living in shelters, falling through the cracks, parents stretched thin. Raymond offered to run free classes. Teach them math, science, reading. Keep them believing they have futures, he'd said. Keanu had agreed on the spot. Raymond had recruited a team. Some were former teachers, some were just willing to help. The tents were going up today. Tomorrow, the first group of kids would arrive. Across the compound, Clara stood in the sun with a roll of canvases under her arm. She wore a clean shirt. Still old, still threadbare, but free of paint smears for the first time in years. Her fingers twitched as she adjusted her grip on the straps. Keanu found her standing in front of the van he'd arranged. It was heading to the city's west side, to the gallery that had offered her a showing. You don't have to do this, Keanu said softly. Clara smirked. Don't back out on me now, Reeves. You promised me a shot. I did, he said, but this isn't a handout. It's your work. She gave him a look. Don't get sentimental. Clara was nervous. He could see it in the way her hands flexed, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. But she didn't let it stop her. She hoisted the canvases over her shoulder, turned on her heel, and marched to the van. Keanu watched as she climbed in without another word. By the end of the day, the gallery owner would call Keanu personally. Clara sold 2 paintings, not for scraps, not for bread or blankets, but for enough to put down a deposit on a small studio. She wouldn't have to trade art for food anymore. She'd sell it because people wanted it, and she'd make her own rules. Thomas was harder to read. He still kept his distance, still watched from the edges. But on the second morning when Keanu arrived at the work site, Thomas was already there. He wore a tool belt slung low on his hips, his sleeves were rolled up, and he was directing a group of men hauling lumber from the back of a truck. Keanu stood nearby for a moment, just watching. Thomas barked orders like he'd been doing it for years. He called out measurements, corrected grip techniques, encouraged without sounding patronizing. When he finally noticed Keanu, he gave him a look. What? Keanu shook his head. Nothing. You watching to see if I screw it up? Thomas asked, hammer in hand. Keanu chuckled. No, I'm just glad you're here. Thomas narrowed his eyes, then sighed. Somebody's got to keep you honest. Keanu nodded. I'm counting on it. The work crews were Thomas's domain now. He'd taken charge of the team responsible for assembling temporary shelters and retrofitting trailers into workspaces. Skeptical as ever, he refused to trust Keanu's motives completely. But he was willing to get the job done, and he was good at it. By day 3, the compound hummed with energy. A tent city that had been slapped together in desperation was slowly becoming a structured community. The learning tents were full of kids and volunteers. Clara's art was hanging in a gallery downtown. Thomas's crews had finished 6 shelters and were halfway through building a new communal space for meetings. The media had started to show up, of course, cameras and microphones. Keanu deflected most of them, insisting the story wasn't about him. But the people in the camp knew the truth. They were building something because someone had believed in them, because someone had shown up. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Keanu stood at the edge of the lot, watching the kids chasing each other between tents, watching Clara sketching new ideas in the dirt with a stick, watching Thomas rolling his shoulders as he sat by a fire pit that hadn't burned in weeks. Raymond appeared beside him, smiling faintly. "You did good," he said. Keanu shook his head. "We did this." Raymond adjusted his glasses. "What happens in 48 hours? Keanu turned toward him. "We show them what's possible." Later that night, around the fire pit, the core group gathered again. Clara back from the gallery with new brushes and fresh canvas, Raymond still holding his clipboard but smiling wider now, Thomas quieter but his hammer resting on the ground beside him like a badge of honor. Keanu sat with them, the notebook open in his lap. Pages now filled with names, ideas, sketches of what this could become. "This is just the start," Keanu said softly. Clara glanced at him. "You think they'll let us stay?" Keanu shrugged. "They won't have a choice." Raymond chuckled. "They'll see what we're building." Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They'll see us." For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled, the stars blinked above them, and in the silence, there was something new. Hope. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. A new story, written by those who had once been forgotten. And Keanu Reeves was right there with them. It started with a mural. Not just any mural, but one that Clara painted in the days following Keanu's announcement of the fund. She worked through the nights under strings of borrowed lights, the tip of her brush moving with precision and purpose on the cracked wall of the old supply depot near the encampment. It was raw, honest. It didn't try to make the streets beautiful, but it told the truth about the lives lived there. At the center of the mural was a woman kneeling on a sidewalk, cradling a child in her arms. Around her were the faint outlines of others, some with instruments, some sketching in notebooks, some rebuilding things from scraps. And above them, like a guardian watching from a distance, was a faceless figure. Not in power, not towering, just standing there with open hands, holding light. Clara didn't sign it. She said it wasn't hers alone. But people noticed. They noticed immediately. By the time a news crew stumbled onto it while covering the delayed eviction, Clara's mural had already been shared across social media by a photographer passing through. The image, striking and stark, made its way through feeds, catching the attention of influencers, journalists, and artists who hadn't stepped foot near Skid Row in years. What is this? Who painted it? Who's behind this? Within hours, the story began to unfold. When the Los Angeles Times ran the headline, it sent shockwaves across the country. Keanu Reeves launches $1 million pilot program for homeless innovators. Underneath it was Clara's mural. And below that, the subheading, "From Actor to Advocate, Inside the Reeves Redemption Project." Keanu groaned when he read it. "Redemption?" he muttered. He sat at a folding table in the encampment's makeshift meeting tent, running his hands through his dark hair as Raymond chuckled across from him. "They need a name for it," Raymond said, tapping the paper with his pen. "Might as well be one you can live with." "I didn't do this for redemption," Keanu said quietly. Raymond nodded. "We know that, but let them call it what they want. It's not about the name." Clara appeared in the doorway with a faint smirk. "You've got a mural now, Reeves. Better get used to it. Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. Did you have to make me the faceless one? Clara shrugged. You said you wanted the focus to be on them, on us. He couldn't argue with that. The media coverage exploded. They came in waves. Networks, news crews, podcasts, bloggers. They asked about the mural, the program, the fund. They wanted to know if Keanu was serious, if this was a one-time gesture or something bigger. Keanu refused most interviews. He wasn't interested in photo ops or press junkets. When asked why, his answer was always the same. This isn't about me. But the story refused to die because people saw the results. The learning tents were full. Kids were reading books, painting, learning math from Raymond and a team of volunteers. Clara's art show had sold out. She was no longer living out of a cart but working in a small studio space where she could create without fear of losing everything. Thomas had organized a work crew that was now contracted by the city to build tiny homes and retrofit them for homeless veterans. And they weren't just statistics. They were faces, stories, proof that this wasn't about charity. It was about investment. They called it the Reeves Redemption Project in city council meetings, in boardrooms, in op-eds. It was catchy, they said, a hook for a complicated idea. Keanu never corrected them. What mattered was the ripple. By the end of the month, 4 more cities had reached out to his team: Oakland, Portland, Chicago, and Atlanta. They wanted to implement their own versions of the pilot program. They wanted to learn how to identify talent within the homeless communities they'd spent years ignoring. Jobs, not handouts, Keanu told them. Opportunities, not pity. The model was simple but revolutionary. Skill inventories, cooperative programs to build and barter, a dedicated fund seeded by Keanu's initial investment, then matched by local donors and city resources. Clear accountability. Leadership from within the community itself. Raymond was flown to Portland to train a team of volunteer educators. Clara's murals were featured in an Atlanta art show focused on voices from the street. Thomas, Skeptical Thomas, was coordinating site visits in Oakland to teach city contractors how to integrate homeless workers into their projects. And Keanu? He stayed in the background. He showed up when it mattered, but he didn't make speeches. He didn't sit for interviews. He didn't want his face on another billboard. He had already done enough of that in Hollywood. Then one morning, it appeared. On a wall in downtown Los Angeles, someone had painted a mural of Keanu. Not a glamorous version, not Neo, not John Wick. Just Keanu, wearing a simple jacket, a backpack slung over one shoulder, his hands in his pockets. His face was quiet, thoughtful. Above him were the words, "Quiet leaders change the world." No one claimed it. Clara swore it wasn't her. Keanu didn't believe her. But it didn't matter. People took pictures. They shared it. They tagged it with Reeves Redemption, Quiet Leader, Change from Within. Within days, donations to the program tripled. Keanu left not long after that. One morning, Raymond woke to find a note on the folding table in the meeting tent. No fanfare, no goodbye speech. It read, "This is yours now. Take care of it. I'll be watching. Geico." Clara found a second note tucked under her paint supplies in the studio. It was folded carefully, smudged with a little charcoal on one edge. Dancing. "Don't stop painting. The world needs to see what you see." Okay? Thomas discovered his much later, stuffed inside the toolbox he'd left in the workshop tent, a scrap of paper with barely a sentence. "You were right to question me. Never stop." They never saw him leave. He was just gone, like a shadow. The Reeves Redemption Project didn't fade with Keanu's absence. If anything, it grew stronger. Cities that had once looked at homelessness as a blight now saw it as an untapped source of creativity and resilience. Programs modeled after Keanu's pilot sprang up across the country. Training centers, co-op workshops, small grants for micro-enterprises. Raymond's education network grew into a formal organization called Rebuild Futures. Clara's art collected international attention. Her mural from Skid Row eventually displayed in the Smithsonian as part of an exhibit titled Art Born from Adversity. Thomas became the de facto leader of the LA program. He still didn't trust most people, but he trusted the work. A year later, a reporter tracked Raymond down. They wanted to know where Keanu was. Raymond smiled faintly and shook his head. "Hell was never the point," he said. Then he went back to teaching his math class. No one really knew where Keanu went. Some said they saw him riding a motorcycle along the Pacific Coast Highway. Others swore he was spotted in Kyoto, sitting quietly in a garden, sketching ideas in a battered notebook. The truth? Keanu Reeves wasn't interested in being found. He had done what he came to do. The movement was alive now, and it didn't need a movie star. It needed people like Raymond, Clara, Thomas, and thousands more, leading from within. And it had them. The mural in downtown LA still stood years later, the paint weathered by rain and smog. But the message was clear, and the world had changed. Not because of noise, not because of fame, but because one quiet leader decided to stand in the background and let others shine. 1 year had passed since the mural first appeared on the old depot wall in Skid Row. 1 year since a quiet man with a weathered backpack and no name had walked into the camp and changed everything. And life had changed, not in loud, explosive ways, but in the steady rhythm of people reclaiming their dignity, one day at a time. Thomas stood at the front of the job center that now anchored the rebuilt encampment. Not that it was an encampment anymore, it was a community. He leaned against the doorframe, clipboard in one hand, a pencil stuck behind his ear, and called out names with an easy confidence. "Rodriguez, you're on the north lot today. Morales, you're shadowing with HVAC at the junior college. Don't be late." A few years ago, Thomas never imagined himself giving orders to men in work boots and reflective vests. He never thought he'd be called boss with anything other than sarcasm. Now he kept the schedule, he negotiated the contracts, he enforced the rules of fairness and accountability, and not a soul questioned him, except himself, every morning. But he remembered what Keanu had said in his note. "You were right to question me. Never stop." So Thomas led, always skeptical, always careful. But he led. A few blocks away, inside what used to be an abandoned storefront, Clara cleaned her brushes after the morning art therapy session. The walls of her studio were covered with colors that told stories far beyond her own. Today's class had been small, just 5 people, all of them quiet, working through their paintings in slow, deliberate strokes. A teenage girl had sketched a portrait of her mother. A man in his 60s had painted his old house from memory. These weren't masterpieces destined for galleries. They were confessions, hopes, grief laid bare on canvas. Clara believed in this work more than she had believed in selling paintings at auctions. This was healing. This was why she had started painting in the first place. The mural she and her students finished last week stretched across the alley next door. A new one, this time showing open hands holding seeds, with roots reaching deep and green shoots stretching toward a warm, bright sky. She didn't sign it, she never did. But people knew who had done it. Raymond walked the halls of the community school with a stack of books under one arm. Kids ran past him, laughter bouncing off the walls like music. A woman from the co-op garden program handed him a bag of fresh carrots at the front door. He thanked her and promised they'd use them in the kitchen class tomorrow. This place, this school, had started as a learning tent under a tarp next to a dying campfire. Now it was 3 connected buildings, with volunteers teaching reading, math, cooking, woodworking, and basic coding. There was a room for music. There was a space for meditation. Raymond had once believed his teaching days were over, that the world had thrown him away. But every morning, when he opened the school, he realized he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And all of it started with a quiet man sitting cross-legged by a fire taking notes. Listening. One crisp afternoon, as the wind picked up and the clouds hung low over Los Angeles, something unusual happened. A small boy, maybe 6 years old, sat crying on a bench in Griffith Park. His shoelace had come undone and he couldn't fix it. No one noticed, except for a man sitting quietly nearby. He was dressed in an old brown jacket and worn jeans, a soft cap pulled low over his face. A black motorcycle helmet rested at his feet. The man stood slowly and walked over. He knelt down without saying a word. With slow, careful hands, he tied the boy's shoe. A double knot, secure. Then he smiled softly and patted the boy on the shoulder before standing and turning away. A mother's voice called out, "Thank you." But the man was already walking back to his bench, already sliding the helmet over his head. Moments later, the quiet rumble of the motorcycle engine drifted through the air, and he was gone. A tourist with a camera snapped a picture. Later, they swore it was him, Keanu Reeves. But no one could be sure. The news was still talking about him. Even now, Fiona Carrington, the respected journalist from Video 142, had aired a special segment called "The Quiet Man Who Gave Everything." Her voice, calm and clear, filled the screen as images played in the background. Clara leading an art class, Thomas shaking hands with city officials at a ribbon cutting, Raymond holding a graduation ceremony in the schoolyard. "Keanu Reeves is not a man of many words," Fiona said, "but his actions speak volumes. Without cameras or press releases, he changed lives. He asked for no applause. He walked away from credit. But the movement he started, what they now call the Reeves Redemption Project, has transformed how cities approach homelessness, not as a problem to be hidden, but as a source of potential to be nurtured." The footage ended with a slow pan of the downtown LA mural. Keanu Reeves, standing quiet, hands in his pockets, the words still bright above his head. Quiet leaders change the world. That evening, as the sun set in brilliant orange and pink across the Pacific, a single motorcycle traced the highway along the cliffs. It moved smoothly, quietly, as if it belonged there, like wind or water. The rider didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him was a city forever changed, a community thriving, a movement growing. Ahead of him was another road, another place that needed someone who would listen, who would stand quietly and help. Keanu Reeves had lived as a beggar for a week. He had walked in the shadows most people ignore. And when he stepped back into the light, he didn't take a bow. He simply went back to being who he always was, the man who gave everything and asked for nothing except hope. The world often celebrates loud victories, bold speeches, public displays of power. But every once in a while, something extraordinary happens in silence. Someone steps forward, not for fame, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. And in that quiet act, a spark ignites that changes everything. Keanu Reeves never wanted headlines. He never asked for applause. What he gave was something far more powerful. He offered dignity. For 7 days, he disappeared from the spotlight. No cameras followed him. No one knew where he had gone. But Keanu knew where he needed to be, not in a mansion or on a film set or behind the wheel of one of his motorcycles. He needed to be there, on the street, at rock bottom, among people who had been forgotten by a world too busy to look down. And when he returned, he didn't come back with empty promises. He didn't offer charity. He offered something deeper, the belief that everyone has potential, that people who have lost everything still have something to give, that their talents, their wisdom, their hearts matter. True strength, Keanu believed, isn't measured in what you take, it's in what you give. And dignity is not something you hand out like spare change. Dignity is restored when someone is given a chance to stand on their own, to work, to create, to teach, to lead, to heal. Keanu didn't just give money, he gave trust. He invested in people that society had written off, and because he did, they proved him right. Thomas, the skeptic who questioned everything, became the one people turned to for guidance. Clara, the artist who once traded her paintings for a warm meal, became a teacher and an inspiration for hundreds more. Raymond, who thought he'd never stand in front of a classroom again, now teaches children who laugh and learn because someone finally believed they deserved a future. This is the power of quiet leadership. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to stand in front of flashing cameras. It works in the shadows, at firesides, on park benches, in forgotten alleyways. It lifts people up without demanding anything in return. And what about Keanu? He's somewhere out there. He's not taking credit. He's not standing at podiums. He's not waving from a stage. He's moving forward, quietly, riding his motorcycle down an empty highway, sitting by a fire with someone who's lost their way, tying the shoelace of a child who thinks no one notices. Maybe you won't see his name in the headlines, but his legacy is everywhere, in the murals that tell stories of hope, in the schools where kids are learning from teachers who never gave up, in the workshops where hands that once trembled now create something beautiful. That's what quiet leadership does. It doesn't fade away. It becomes part of the world it helped to heal. And now, it's your turn to think about the power you hold, not as a celebrity, not as a billionaire, but as a person. Because every one of us can lead quietly. We can choose to listen when no one else will. We can offer a hand when others walk by. We can see people, really see them, when the rest of the world looks away. That's not charity, that's dignity. Maybe you've seen this kind of leadership before. Maybe you've witnessed someone step up without asking for anything. Maybe you've been that person for someone else. So here's our question for you. Have you ever witnessed quiet leadership like Keanu's? Tell us in the comments. Your story could inspire someone else. Your words could be the spark that changes someone's life. And if this story moved you, if Keanu's journey made you think differently about compassion, dignity, and quiet strength, we invite you to stand with us. If you believe in standing for what's right, like this video and share Keanu's incredible story. Help us spread the message that hope is never lost, and that sometimes the quietest voices make the biggest difference. And if you want more stories like this, stories of courage, resilience, and the quiet leaders who change the world without ever asking for attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Because this is just one story. There are countless more waiting to be told. In a world filled with noise, it's easy to overlook the quiet heroes. But not here. Not on this channel. We honor them. We tell their stories. And we remind you that true strength is in giving dignity, not charity. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video. And until then, stay kind, stay strong, and lead quietly.